Dear students, welcome back. Today we will discuss John Locke, the philosophical father of classical liberalism, and also who gave philosophical basis and justification for modern capitalism and free market economy. He was also, like Hobbes, a 17th century or late 17th century English philosopher, but his ideas on state of nature, social contract, and nature of government were very different from and very different perspective what Hobbes postulated. And he became much more acceptable, palatable, and popular, and still in modern political theory, he's considered as a kind of grandfather of liberalism and capitalism. We will see that why it became so that he and not Hobbes became so very popular, though their philosophy's essence is almost same. That also we'll try to see all from examination point of view. So let us begin. Dear students, every philosopher I have been repeating speaks of his time. His thought basically reflect what was going around him when he was growing, what kind of society he was living in. That's why we study life and time of any philosopher, and same with Locke. John Locke was born in 1632 in a village, Somerset in England. His parents were a bit middle class, Protestant, Puritan Christian, and they were trader, landowner, and his father was sympathetic to the parliamentarian and the Whig party. Just to tell you, at that time, it's important to understand Locke's philosophy that there was going a rift between the parliamentarian who wanted constitutional monarchy in England versus the royalist who believed that there is a divine right of absolute kingdom or monarchy, and that class conflict culminated into glorious revolution of 1688, in which parliamentarian won and England became a constitutional monarchy. Of course, Locke and his father also were on the sides of parliamentarian, and those were supporters of Whig party at that time, and opposition was Tory party. So many feel that Locke's political philosophy was a kind of justification for the parliamentarian and also the emerging bourgeoisie and capitalist class. So one way to look that why he wrote like that and how it is different from Hobbes, who was on the side of royalists, you say. That's why his philosophy is that there should be absolute monarchy, whereas Locke says no, constitutional monarchy, parliament is supreme. You can see how the thought inscribes the time and the situation, the circumstances in which the philosopher find himself or his life. So that was the time. And at that time, the Europeans were also settling in America. That also affected Locke's thought. He was himself a guiding factor in the constitution making of Carolina state in southern USA, and capitalism was rising, and his theory of property and natural right gave a philosophical base to that. He studied many subjects: literature, medicine, philosophy, chemistry, theology. His theology is very important. Just like Gandhiji, he mixed religion into political philosophy. For him also, the politics should be moral, should be ethical, and God's command should be seen as natural law, which also same as a man sees through his sense of reason or rationality. But there is no divergence between what God commands and what comes in our mind through the sense of reason. Both are same as natural law. As I told you, he was active in Whig party, and he was a friend, philosopher guide in Earl of Shaftesbury, who helped him to understand the nuances of running government and trade and other matters. And as I told you, he was also guiding the constitution writing in Carolina. His main creation were all came when he passed, his age was past 50 years, 1689, a letter concerning toleration that also became a philosophical base of pluralism and modern liberal democracy. 1689, two treatises on government on which this video is based. His seminal work, his political philosophy is contained in this. 1690, an essay concerning human understanding, that is also very important to understand how he thought nature of man was. And 1693, some thoughts concerning education, that also became very important, in which he says that the mind of a child is like tabula rasa, like a blank slate where anything can be written. That was very different from the established notion that God sent child with lot many innate kind of understanding in the brain. And he was the guiding and spiritual father of 18th century Enlightenment, classical liberalism and capitalism and free market economy, that I have already told you. And he influenced both French and American Revolution and American Declaration of Independence, in which Jefferson famously said that the independence and the Constitution guarantees everyone the right of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And that came from John Locke's theory of natural right, life, liberty, and property. So this was the life and time of Locke. Let us begin with the political philosophy of Locke in a nutshell. And then we will just dissect in bit detail each one of these parts. First is in the state of nature, how Locke defined it, that men have perfect freedom and equality in the state of nature. He defines a state of nature as a condition of human relationship where there is no higher political authority to settle dispute and punish anybody if he is infringing a law. That's all. So, but at that time, the man had reason and rationality to self-govern themselves, not only self-govern, but also to live socially with peace, goodwill, mutual assistance, and self and others' preservation. And that reason and rationality also helped them in acquiring property. So this was the state of nature in view of Locke. It is very different than how Hobbes saw that. But in the absence of universally accepted law, natural law were there, but it was not defined. Anybody could have interpreted in its own way. There was no impartial judge. Everybody was judged in his own or others' cases, and there was no higher power to settle dispute. In such condition, the peace in the state of nature was fragile, and there was always a constant danger to have a conflict and war, as Hobbes saw. Hence, to remove the inconvenience. See here the difference. He says that, okay, the state of nature is okay, we can govern ourselves, we can live somewhat peacefully with others, but there was a lot of inconvenience because there is no impartial judge and accepted law and the higher power to settle dispute. So the rights are not very much able to be exercised by humans. So to just remove this inconvenience and to make their status better off, the people came out of a state of nature by signing a contract, like an explicit consent that we are here by signing a contract or agreement, covenant with one and all to set up a sovereign community by transferring some of their right, mind it, only some of their right, not their natural right of life, liberty, property, but only to be judged in own and others' cases. That judgment, private judgment, is a surrender to a higher sovereign community by a contract. This political community then by majority vote set up the government, which is having two parts, legislative and executive. Legislative makes law, executive implement that law in particular case. Legislative is supreme, executive is subordinate to legislative. Legislative is basically parliament, executive is king or monarch or government, president, prime minister, like that. And in his view, very different from Hobbes, the government, or if you say sovereign, is not absolute. It is also party to the contract and bound by its obligation to act for common good or public good within the parameters of civil law. So it is not above law. And citizens have rights to resist and change the government acting arbitrarily if it is not following the norms of the natural law or the contract, or acting arbitrarily or tyrannically and fails to protect the right of life, liberty, and property of citizens. Citizens have every right to change that government. That you can see how different it was from Hobbes' postulation, where he thought a absolute monarchy, where we have got very little right against the sovereign who was not part of that contract, and there was very limited right to resistance to that kind of tyrannical government. So this is all about political philosophy of Locke. Now we will discuss a bit detail how he thought nature of man was, then state of nature, then the social contract, the crux, the theory of property right of Locke, which became the philosophical base of capitalism, and nature of government, which again became a kind of bedrock for contemporary liberal democratic government. And then we will also discuss a bit about why he is considered father of classical liberalism and capitalism, and then finally some critique to Locke's political philosophy. If we see nature of man, it came mainly from his essay concerning human understanding. In his view, the human beings are naturally endowed with certain basic instincts such as decency, goodness, socially inclination, and capability of ruling themselves by sense of reason. How different it is. Repeatedly, I am saying how Hobbes saw it. Later on, we'll see that it's not very different. Along with this decency or goodness and sociability, man also seeks pleasure, avoid pain, is self-interested, but is rational, having sense of reason, which help him to discover the law of nature, that how he should behave in the absence of a higher political authority to govern himself and live somewhat cordially with others. So he, by the sense of that reason and law of nature, he could recognize one's right vis-a-vis others, and that helped him in living in the state of nature. Men are naturally able to govern themselves and live with harmony with others by the law of nature. It's a repetition, and law of nature came from the sense of reason in every man and given by the God. Uh, that's why Locke thought that this natural law is like moral commands of God. Since God created man, God only gave the sense of reason to recognize, discover the law of nature, which is nothing but a same as moral commands of God. So there is no inconsistency between the God's command and humans' discovery by his sense of reason what natural law should be. He see the way he mixed theology or God into the reason, where Hobbes totally separated the reason and rationality from anything like theology or God's command. Maybe because of this, his view became more acceptable because it mixed a kind of spirituality and religion into the politics the same way as Gandhiji did. Men are rational because of an innate sense of reason. Of course, he also accepted, like Hobbes, that sense of reason make us rational even in a state of nature. With the help of reason, human beings learn to control their emotions, anger, love, and so on. And this is the reason that a kind of peace, maybe precarious or fragile, was maintained even without a higher political authority in a state of nature. But at the same time, some men, Locke said, may be selfish, competitive, aggressive, maybe like outlaws or criminal-minded, but those are exceptions than rule, and they need to be controlled. So this is the nature of man as per Locke. You should compare it with how different it is from Hobbes' conception of nature of man. On this basis, how Locke saw the state of nature. I'm repeating by saying that for Locke, it is not a geographic condition or any historical event or prehistoric time. It is simply the way humans manage their relationship without any superior authority to judge between them. As simple as it is. So Locke says that in any time a person may find himself in the state of nature. like in Somalia, where there is no state of nature. So there is no legitimate political authority to settle disputes, maintain peace and order. Mind here, legitimate. So as per Locke, even a tyrannical, authoritarian or absolute monarchy is also a state of nature because it is not a legitimate political authority to settle dispute. Then each individual is having absolute freedom and perfect equality and independence. Nobody is subordinate to other in the state of nature, but all are bound by law of nature. And you know that law of nature is like moral command of God, which also is consistent as human sense it through his reason and rationality. But the problem in a state of nature is private judgment. Each one is judge, jury, and executioner in his own case, and whenever breaches of natural law committed by other, anybody can punish anyone by his own sense of judgment. So this is chaotic. As Hobbes saw it, same Locke is also telling that this private judgment may lead to war of all against all. Each individual possesses natural right, perfect freedom and equality, as you see. And rights were what? Right to life, liberty, and property. So right to preserve his life, liberty, and property, and to be judged and punish breaches of natural law. The last right, the right to be judged and punish breaches of natural law, actually became the reason for the social contract because it would have generated into a lot of conflict. But all these natural rights, power, jurisdiction was reciprocal. What is meaning of reciprocal? It is as accepted by the other. So suppose you have got the right to property, but it is only dependent upon if your other persons accept that. You have got perfect equality, but others are also having. You have got liberty to acquire as much power, as much resources you wish, but others have the same power. So it is reciprocal. If you accept their right, they will accept your right. So that was the system in state of nature. And in Locke's view, it was a state of general peace, goodwill, mutual assistance, and preservation, mainly because of somewhat good and social behavior or innate nature of human and their understanding of the natural law. Because of these two reasons, the state of nature was general peace, goodwill, mutual assistance, and preservation. But this peace was very fragile, very insecure, because it was very inconvenient, and danger of war and conflict always loomed large because each one is self-interested. As Hobbes saw, Locke also saw the same. They want recognition, power, property, and most importantly, there was a private judgment. All were judged in their own and others' case, and violation of some self-interested, aggressive, degenerate man. All these made the life and status of right in a state of nature very inconvenient and fragile. This became the basis why they came to set up a political community by a social contract. So what was this social contract? This is the third time we are discussing after Rousseau's and Hobbes' social contract, and see the difference, try to differentiate. People came out of a state of nature through mutual agreement by surrendering their right to be judged in their own case and in case of others. Mind it again and again that they only surrendered that right, that now they are not judging in their own case or in case of others if anybody is violating natural law, leaving it to an impartial judge of a superior political authority. Only this right they surrendered, not their right of life, liberty, and property. So they set up a superior political authority by way of contract covenant among themselves. And this contract was by explicit consent of all. Means there is no majority vote. Unanimously, they consented to set up a higher political authority. You can take it as a state or a body politic or like that. All agreed to pool their natural power and uphold natural right of life, liberty, and property of one another by transferring some of their right to the sovereign community. So the purpose of the social contract was to make their life better off by having more secured natural right, peace and peace and order, so that life may become more progressive and prosperous. So the reason why they entered into social contract, in last slide we discussed there were four problems or inconveniences in the state of nature. Let us repeat that. First is that in state of nature there were natural law, but all were interpreter of that, so there was no known universal standard law. Second was there was no impartial judge to settle disputes. Everybody was judged in its own and cases of others. There were no higher accepted power to enforce punishment for breach of law. Also, anybody had that power, and that was chaotic. And finally, there were few outlaws. They behaved licentiously, irrationally, and self-interested behavior of few aggressive degenerate men, and a higher political authority was required to control that. So these four reasons you should write in examination, that why they entered into the social contract, and these were the inconvenience. Mind the word inconvenience. The most important feature of the contract is that it was a two-stage contract, two-stage contract, very different from single step of Rousseau and Hobbes. In the first stage or step, there was a contract to form political community by pooling the powers and vesting rights of all the people who consented unanimously to come into that contract. In the second state, when this community, so the first step, the community was formed, political community. In the second step, the political community by majority vote set up the government. Government had two parts, legislative and executive, as I told you, and executive were subordinate to legislative. Legislative were to make laws, or which should conform to natural law, and executive to interpret and administer law in particular cases. Legislative were supreme and executive were subordinate to it. Mind it here that executive function also included judiciary, which is nothing but a interpreting the law. So this was the social contract of Locke. If we see the features of social contract, this will make the concept a bit more clear to you. As I told you, I am repeating, it was a two-stage contract. The first stage, it was by unanimous vote, express consent of all to set up a political community. Second stage, by a majority vote of the community's representative, by a tacit consent to form government having two parts, legislative and executive. Only partial natural right of being judged in own case and in cases of others were surrendered. Mind it, third or fourth time I am saying, it is so important. Natural right of life, liberty and property were not surrendered. This everybody kept with himself. Purpose of the contract is to increase the effectiveness of natural right of life, liberty and property and make life better off, not worse off, as Hobbes felt. Not he said that worse off, he in his view state of nature is even worse off, but Locke said no, we came into contract only to further our interest, better protect our natural right, and we would have left in the state of nature bit of inconvenience. It was not so much inconvenient, but to make our life better, to have peace and prosperity, progress, we set up this political community, which has got a limited right. The government is also party to the contract. There's a very big difference between Hobbes. Hobbes says that no, government is not party to the contract. The absolute sovereignty or Leviathan is out of the contract. He's above law. No, here the government is to follow the law. Hence, all provisions of the contract are applicable to government also. It is a limited government, the bedrock of liberalism. Government is not only to follow the civil law, which is made by the community or legislative, it is also to follow the natural law. It cannot go beyond that. And it should work only for the public good, common good, not for any private interest. And it is to protect, its duty is to protect the peace and prosperity, peace and order, peace and security of the people must be maintained by the government. It's their natural right, must be protected by the government. Otherwise, people have got every right to change that government. And government cannot act arbitrarily or tyrannically. In that case, the people who constituted the political community have got every right to uh, to resist or kind of revolution, the right to revolution against those government. So the community is permanent. In Locke's view, the first contract gives a permanency to that political community. Government which is formed by second contract is not a permanent entity. It can be changed any time by the legislative command, by vote, or by the community. Even legislative can be changed. And sovereign resides in the community. This is the notion of popular sovereignty. Of course, the sovereignty is exercised by the representative of the community, by the legislative through maybe majority vote, you can say, not like Rousseau where the sovereignty is with people and every time absolute majority or majority is required of the community. Here the representative form of legislative is conceptualized by Locke. It is different from Rousseau's. So these are some of the features of the social contract. Here I am taking George Holland Sabine's visualization of 4 layers of political order coming through the social contract as conceptualized by Locke. In the top, there are, or you can say the bedrock or building block, there are individuals who come together to have that contract and covenant. They retain their natural right of life, liberty, property, only surrender their right to be judged in their own and others' cases. So they are the building block of this political order. Then the individual form the community where sovereignty lie. You can understand the community as civil society or where sovereignty resides. That's why a kind of popular sovereignty. So this is the second order or second layer of the political order. In the third layer comes the legislative, which is a kind of parliament. It represents the community. So representative parliament concept is there. It's a supreme power. So sovereignty actually resides in community but exercised by the legislative by majority vote. It is very same as in liberal democracy world over. So you can understand how liberal democracy takes the political philosophy from Locke. Why representative, which we call parliament, exercise the sovereignty of the people. Actually sovereignty lies with people but exercised by the legislative. And at the final, and legislative is what? They make law conforming to natural laws. Civil law. They form civil law, formulate civil law. And finally, the fourth order or fourth layer of the political order is the executive, which can be constitutional monarchy like in England, or king, or government, president, prime minister as in India, US and all. They are the executive. And what's the role of executive? To interpret and apply law in particular case, maintain peace and order, and do everything to further the interest of the community, trade, industry, protecting the border, foreign relation, everything is a part of executive function. But it is subordinate to legislative, which is again subordinate to community, and community is subordinate to individual. So individual is the autonomous, that is the atom through which all this is made. And individuals in the right, natural right is sacrosanct life, right of life, liberty, property. You can see how bedrock of political philosophy of liberalism is there in this 4 layer of the political order as conceptualized by Locke. After discussing so much, I think this slide is a bit repetition. You can yourself read. Basically, the government is formed by the second step contract by majority vote by the political community, which was itself formed by the first step contract by the unanimous vote or express consent. It's a two-part government, means that there are two levels of government or two functions of government. One is legislative function, other is executive function. Legislative is the supreme power which makes law. Executive is subordinate to legislature. Government is as a trustee to the community, same way as parents are trustee to the children. See the difference. Locke says that government is not like master, citizens are not like slave. Government is like parent who are simply trusty to the citizen who are like children. Of course, grown up and reasoned and rational children. Government is bound to act to further public good, common good, and act as per the civil law, conforming to the natural law. It is not supposed to act arbitrarily and tyrannically. So it is a constitutional government, that is, that it itself follows the constitution or fundamental law through which it is constituted. So the government must govern with the consent of the people. Government is created by the will of the people to further the preservation of humanity, further the peace and prosperity and security of the people who came to make the contract. It is an artificial device. It does not embody superior reasons. It is not actually sovereign. Sovereignty lies with the people expressed through its majority will, through its legislative. Duties of the government, as I told you, to make known and universal law conforming to natural law, that is legislative duties, to protect natural right and to adjudicate dispute, punish one who breaks law, maintain peace and order, this is executive duty, and to manage relation with other state communities and protect from external aggression, this is a federating duties as Locke said it. Limited government. Uh, why it is a limited government? Because it has got limited rights and duties. It should take tax just what is needed to maintain order, not more. So tax should be moderate. It has got no right to snatch property from people without its consent. It should protect, its duty is bounden duties to protect rights, maintain peace and order, protect from external aggression. People community have rights to overthrow and change government if it fails to protect rights of the citizen and fails to maintain peace and order, act arbitrarily or tyrannically, or it is not able to protect from external aggression. So these are the nature of government which we are basically repeating. So you must have understood by now why Locke is considered father of classical liberalism. Everything what we understand by classical liberalism, the right of the individual freedom in the economy and social field, limited constitutional government, seeing government or state as necessary evil, night watchman state, and consent as the base of legitimate government, tolerance, pluralism, these all emanate from Locke's political philosophy, what we have seen, his nature of government. Philosophical basis to capitalism also come from Locke's thought, his concept of property right, we will see next, became the basis for the capitalism and free market economy. Then minimum taxation and government to maintain peace, settle dispute, this all became very important for capitalism. He combined individualism, utilitarianism, because he also talked of pleasure and peace, pleasure and pain, increasing pleasure, reducing pain, that became the basis for utilitarianism. Individualism was, in fact, the core thought of Hobbes as well as Locke, of course, because it was individual who came together to form the community, which became the sovereign, and then government was formed. So individual was most important. Government's duty is to protect individual rights. And capitalism also, so he mixed or meshed these whole phenomena, individualism, utilitarianism, and capitalism, with the moral reasoning and theology. See, this was the beauty of Locke. Hobbes completely separated the spiritual or religious or moral or God's command from this region, rationality, individualism, and political order. Locke mixed it. I am repeating myself just like Gandhiji. And you know human tendency, people always accept when something is God's moral command. When something is told as ethical, moral, then people are attracted towards it. So he became a kind of guiding figure for liberalism and capitalism, not Hobbes, who was a kind of very negative kind of person. So this is the reason why Locke became immortal and his views were inscribed in liberalism and capitalism, And if you see the modern liberal order, both the capitalist world and liberal democracy, you can see Locke's philosophy is guiding actually the modern world. This is the way. Even in India, you can see how much his thought of limited government, constitutional government, and property rights, or not to that extent, but free market economy, all is practiced by the philosophy given by Locke so many centuries before. It's very interesting to discuss Locke's theory of property right, which became the basis of modern capitalism and free market economy. His view was that God has given the earth and all its natural resources to all men in common. So he understands the commons. Every resource is for everybody to use. Nobody is owner of that. But in his view, God has also gave man reason to make use of the common resource to the best advantage of life and convenience. Here comes the opportunity to appropriate some common resources as a private property. So for this, he gave a model, workmanship model. He says that just like God created human, and that's why he owns human, if we create something by our own body, limbs, and hands, by means by our labor, what he says that when we mix our labor to some natural resources, we till the soil, we collect the fruit, we cut the grass, then that natural resource become our private property. So in a sense, he says that if we make something by our labor, that something becomes our private property. Before that, it was a common natural property for all. So he defined property as fruit of labor. And if we do this, like mix our labor in some natural resource to make the property or appropriate that property, no consent of others is required for that. This is very controversial. You can always argue that, as Rousseau said, that one person enclosed a land and yelled that this is my property, and everybody else were so simple to accept that he person was the founder of the civil society. He mocked that. You can argue, but he said that, and at that time when the resource was in plenty, might be his philosophy was not so controversial. In the wider sense, right to property include the right to life, liberty, and external possession. For him, the right to property was something like, since you own your body as your property, so right to life is nothing but right to property of your body. Right to liberty is your property. Equality is your property. So in a wider sense, right to property means right to life, liberty, and external possessions. But he also, because he always bound human beings by the moral command of God, ethical or morality or universal percept, he gave three limitations, three conditions for acquiring property. First is a wastage restriction. He says that one may only have as much property as one can use before it spoils. You cannot waste that. Second is a sufficiency restriction, which again is very controversial. One must leave enough and as good for others. Means no one should acquire so much property that others are not left anything to even have the subsistence. So that also is can be debated. And third is labor restriction, that one may only acquire property through one's own labor. This again is very controversial, because he did not accept that if you own wage labor, Locke says that it is your labor if you pay for labor. So your slave, if your slave is cutting a grass, a servant is cutting a grass, your horse is grazing a grass, it becomes yours. So that is also very controversial, that by labor what he meant. So there are three restrictions: wastage restriction, sufficiency restriction, and labor restrictions by Locke. And also he said that there is a duty of charity towards those who have no other means of subsistence. You see here how much he is mixing morality and ethics into this right to property. In modern capitalism, we very conveniently forget his moral ethical restrictions and only remember absolute right to property. And finally, his taxation right to government, in his view, is very, very limited. Property is a natural right derived from natural law. It is therefore prior to becoming government. It's for the protection of the property that men entered into an agreement or contract. So government has got no right to take property to use for the common good without the consent of the property owner. Minimum taxation by the majority vote of the legislative should be the norm. So this is the way the concept of limited or night watchman government came, or laissez-faire government, you can say. So this was Locke's theory of property right. Now, finally, we are discussing some of the critique of Locke's political philosophy. Despite his being very acceptable and prominent philosopher during his lifetime itself, and becoming the philosophical father for both liberalism and capitalism, there are no dearth of a lot of critique of his political philosophy. First and foremost, many felt that Locke wrote to provide theoretical basis to emerging capitalist class and the constitutional monarchy in England. So he basically justified what he believed at that time. He was in the side of parliamentarian. He was himself coming from the trading class, and he himself invested in American trade. So he justified through his writing what he believed in. So natural right to private property, limited government having minimum taxation rights, representative government, decision by majority, voting rights only to property male. These all were became a bit a kind of apologist, you can say, for capitalism and liberalism, and that times tide when it was turning towards constitutional monarchy and emerging bourgeoisie class. And last, you can see this voting right only to property male. Nobody can feel that it was good. His justification of private property drew maximum criticism. The three restrictions, that wastage, sufficiency, and labor, all were meaningless, because wastage, by invention of money, there was no concept of wasting of property. Money can be very conveniently and safely can be stored because without any spoilage. Sufficiency also lost its significance because without land also one can have the subsistence, measure for subsistence, and also how much to live was very, very vague in what he said, that others should have good measure sufficient so that they may have their subsistence, but how much? He could not define it. And labor, as I told you, became meaningless because when one can hire labor, wage labor, or slave also can work for him, then what is the meaning of telling that only by your own labor you can acquire property? What's the meaning of own labor? Also, his theory that when you mix your labor with any natural resources, it becomes your property, was mocked by Robert Nozick in his famous way when he says that I make a tomato juice by my own labor and mix it into the sea, and sea becomes mine. So this kind of critiques were there. Macpherson wrote Possessive Individualism, scathing criticism to Locke's theory of property. He said, in his view, Locke postulated differential rationality between capitalists. For capitalists, there was one rationality, and for wage labor, there were another. And it divided the society into distinct classes. In fact, Locke's this theory became the basis for Marx to argue for the class and the deprivation or alienation of labor class, how his labor is owned by the capitalist class, as postulated by Locke. Then Waldron, Siemens, and Nozick criticize workmanship model and principles of mixing labor. I told you many like workmanship model. Many of these authors said that God created human, that's why he owned human. But are we created? When we make a chair, are we creating it? When we are tilling the land, are we creating? Creation is not human's ability, and that's why we cannot own anything. And what was the basis of natural law? As we discussed, It was it reason, sense of reason, rationality, or universal moral percept, as Kant said, or it was a divine command? He could not explain. Some places Locke seems to have said that it's like God's moral command. Sometimes he says that your sense of reason discover natural law, which is not inconsistent with the moral command. So he gave a confusing message as to what were the basis of the natural law. So this is one of the critique, and just as many of in his writing he seems to justify patriarchy, then wage labor, no political right to atheist and non-property class, and contradictory theory and practice of slavery. In fact, he invested in slave trade, but he wrote against slavery. So these are some of the critique of Locke's political philosophy. If we see the past year's question, I have taken from Delhi University. In other universities also same type of questions might have been asked. First is discuss Locke's theory of social contract. This we have discussed in detail. Second is why John Locke is considered as father of classical liberalism. We have seen. Third is discuss Locke's theory of natural rights, especially property right. That also we have discussed, especially the property right. So students, thank you. These are the references you can refer. Online resources are also from where I have taken. Of course, this is not comprehensive. I read a lot more to discuss all these. And thanks for watching. If you have liked the video, please share it and subscribe it, because it will help me in maintaining my passion and take this knowledge to many other students. Be safe, enjoy whatever life gives you in this period of transition and pandemic, and see you with next video. Bye. Be safe.